Hello, for today's tasting I'm taking a look at a wine from Kumeu River. This is Matty's Vineyard Chardonnay from 2023, and this is finishing up my look at Kumeu River's 2023 Chardonnays. Wine Searchers' offices are in a place called New Lynn. We're on the west side of Auckland, and so we're about 20 kilometres from Kumeu, so it's quite an easy visit for us to make out to the winery there. Fairly recently we took our dedicated bunch of wine specialists out there to taste through the relatively recently released vintage. I have to say, we were really quite impressed by the wines that they produced in 2023 and how they had dealt with some real challenges in what was a fairly difficult vintage. Kumeu River are of course famous for their Chardonnays, and in particular their single vineyard wines, most especially Matty's Vineyard, which is often compared very favourably to some of the finest of white Burgundies. But in early 2023 the Auckland region was hit by a series of really quite nasty weather, rainfall incidents. So on the 27th of January, for instance, we were hit by a cyclone, and in Kumeu 10 inches of rain fell in a period of less than 12 hours. This rainfall had caused the small creek that runs next to Matty's Vineyard, the Kumeu River, to burst its banks and flood, and for a short period of time both the winery and a portion of Matty's Vineyard had been flooded. I remember driving past the winery trying to get home that night, and actually from that point I kind of assumed there wasn't going to be any Matty's Vineyard Chardonnay for 2023. Now, a little bit of background. Matty's Vineyard is named after Matty Brakovich, and Matty had come to Kumeu in 1944. He came with his father Mick and his mother Kate, immigrants to New Zealand who'd come from Croatia. They'd come to New Zealand in 1937 and had worked hard and had saved money and were able to buy in 1944 this land in Kumeu, which they started clearing and planted a vineyard. Unfortunately, Matty's father died, and therefore it was really Matty, his wife Melba, and their children Michael, Paul, Millen and Mariana who've built the estate's excellent international reputation. Now, Matty's Vineyard is immediately across the road from the winery. It's the site of their original vineyard, and it was here in 1990 that Matty started planting Chardonnay. He felt that they needed to move away from producing everyday styles of drinking wine for the local market and embrace international varieties such as Chardonnay that could be sold on an international market. The site is a gently sloping north-facing vineyard, and on it the family planted some of New Zealand's first Mendoza clone Chardonnay. So at that stage, Mendoza clone was probably the highest quality clone available, and it's renowned for producing wines with quite good acidity. Alas, Matty passed away in 1992, a year before the first fruit was harvested to make wine from this vineyard. And wines have borne the Matty's Vineyard label for over 30 years now. The vines in Matty's Vineyard are 33 years old, making them some of the oldest Mendoza clone Chardonnay in New Zealand. They're also infected with leaf roll virus, so old vines naturally reduce their yields, but the leaf roll virus has caused a further yield reduction that leads to some really concentrated fruit coming from this vineyard. The issue with the 2023 vineyard, however, wasn't the flooding that had worried me. The downpours had washed away the sprays on the leaves that should have protected the vines from fungal infections, and as a result downy mildew took hold. There was no way to get into these vineyards, which have waterlogged heavy clay soils, with spraying equipment. The downy mildew pretty much defoliated most of Kumeu River's vineyards. Deprived of leaves, the vines were unable to continue ripening the fruit, so most of the fruit was healthy. It was in quite good condition, but ended up being picked significantly earlier simply because ripening had stopped. Harvest was entirely conducted by hand, and a very careful selection was applied to the fruit so that only healthy fruit made its way into the presses. The bunches were pressed as whole bunches, and the juice was given a period of settling, but that was quite brief, so that the juice could go quite cloudy into barrel where it would start fermenting. Now, fermentations are conducted here entirely with indigenous yeasts, so these are the yeasts that are found in the vineyard or might already exist in the winery already conducting fermentations. And one of the results of this is that each individual fermentation has its own character, because they may have started with different yeast strains, they may be in different portions of the cellar where there's different temperatures, and so each fermentation progresses differently, producing slightly different flavours, giving the winemaker plenty of blending options to use. and giving a wonderful complexity to the final wine. Now in 2023 they chose not to use any new oak for fermentation or aging, so the barrels that we used were mostly a combination of 1 year and 2 year old barrels. And actually the fact that they weren't using many older barrels than that sort of compensated for the lack of new oak, because there's still some oak character comes from particularly a 1 year old barrel. These barrels were 228 litre Burgundy barriques. All the wine underwent malolactic conversion and stayed in barrel for 11 months. And all the time that it was in barrel, it was there with the lees created by the dead yeasts. So these helped to protect the wine against oxidation and would have imparted a certain amount of richness to the wine as well. So let's have a look at the wine and see what we make of it. Here we've got a medium yellow colour. It's quite a nice vibrancy to it. I'm swirling it, wondering if it will cause tears to form on the side of the glass there. Having said that, the wine is only labelled as 12.5% alcohol. It does appear to be trying to cling to the side of the glass, but there aren't particularly obvious tears. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas have a lovely, rich, ripe peach note. There's an elegance to that, and I think it's supported by a little bit of toasty oak, which is underpinned by some rounded, rich vanilla notes. All these elements are very well married in the wine. The oak is very well married in the wine. It's certainly not bursting out. It's certainly not dominating that really lovely peachy fruit. So let's have a taste. On the palate, there's a really wonderful crisp acidity. At the same time as I'm finding the acidity to be quite mouth-watering, I'm also seeing some well-defined cedary notes on the edges of my tongue that are becoming more sort of mealy. Some of the creamy notes that are coming from the aging with the yeast lees are starting to meld with those, and there's really quite a sort of a mealy richness. Underlying all this, there's this lovely mineral acidity that's giving a lovely definition and length to the finish. There I think you see some lemony crispness as the acidity comes more to the fore. There are just some mineral hints, almost a sort of a touch of, there are some mineral hints, there are toasty touches and hints of wet stone as you head towards the finish. You don't really notice the alcohol. It's nicely in balance with the mid palate. It certainly doesn't have the weight and richness I would normally expect to see from Matty's Vineyard Chardonnay. But that being said, Matty's Vineyard is often quite sort of tight and closed up when it's young, and I would fully expect this to sort of open and show a bit more rich, rounded fruit given 2 or 3 years in bottle. I think the oak notes lead me to suggest that I probably would leave this wine for another couple of years, just for those to become a little more integrated. This might not be a vintage of Matty's Chardonnay that I'd put away for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. I think it's possibly one that would drink earlier. Certainly the acidity and the self-assured concentration of what is mid-weight fruit on the palate gives me the confidence to think that this wine would age beautifully. An impressive wine that I think actually shows what lovely classic Chardonnays can be produced in New Zealand, even in what was a challenging vintage. I'd also say that with yields being down quite significantly, if you're thinking of buying this vintage and you haven't bought it already, it's probably worth doing so fairly quickly, because there's not a lot of it around. Given its quality, it will vanish fairly quickly. I looked at our Wine Searcher aggregated score for this vintage of this wine, and this is getting 93 out of 100, which I think is a score it can justify, but I think is an incredible testament to the hard work that must have gone on, first in the vineyard and then in the winery, to produce this wine in this challenging vintage. I will pop a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and that way you can follow that link and you can find out where the wine is available near you, what its pricing might be. There are also tabs on that page which will allow you to find out more about the region it comes from, the producer, the grape variety, the winemaking, critics' scores and their notes, what other users have thought about the wine, any awards it's won, price history, and there's another tab on that page where you can compare the different vintages. All the information you might possibly need to make an informed decision about buying this wine. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed watching the tasting. If you have, we'd be really grateful if you'd press the like button. That would be fantastic. If you would like to watch more of these videos, do please sign up and subscribe to our channel, and you can set yourself a notification, and that way you can be alerted whenever we publish a new video. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please pass it on to them. We'd really appreciate that sort of endorsement from you. So thank you once again for joining us, and I do hope you'll find some time in the very near future to come and watch another tasting video with us. Bye till then.